I was out of a job and I was living in a kind of a little bunk out there in Malibu because I had sent my wife back to New York to open the fish store for the summer. She only stayed open the summer, when the summer community came, because the fish store was my fallback community. It was called Loaves and Fishes. It's now become a very fancy store, and I think they sell lobster for $40 a pound there now, or something like that. And four women took over for her and my daughters, and but so I was alone. She was back there running the fish store, so we could put bread on the table. And Robbie said that Harold Hecht, who had been part of Hecht Hill Lancaster, had been. I remember when my father died, they referred to him as the president of the defunct Goldman Stores Corporation. I remember that word, defunct. It was the ugliest word I'd ever seen, and a word that the New York Times rarely uses, and it's so anachronistic. And that was Harold Hecht. He was defunct too, and he was trying to do a remake of Cat Ballou. That had been his last big hit. So he said he hired me to do a treatment for a very small amount of money. I didn't really know how to do a treatment. I didn't know what a treatment was. And he said, just put a little bit on one page, then make another page. He said, you don't need to make it so beautiful. You make it too beautiful. He was the one who said I wrote too well. And actually, I learned, like on a Sunday, from Tom Pollock, who was his lawyer, who eventually became head of Universal, was at that time sort of kind of slumming at that time, even because a lawyer with the kind of beach set out there in Malibu that I was hanging around the fringes with. He said, Harold Hecht is not going to pick up your option. He was Hecht's attorney. He, abused his privilege there. I thought, oh my God, this is over now. And the next day I got a call from Robbie Lance saying that Milos Forman was looking for somebody to do One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He had a script he didn't like, he wasn't satisfied with. They had Jack Nicholson, but they were afraid Jack Nicholson was going to leave. And he said he was talking to a number of writers, and Milos had seen the script to Shoot the Moon, which of course had not been produced, turned down by everybody. You take it to the studios, and they'd say, which was because it was about divorce, and always whoever, the head of development or the head of the studio says, I love it, it's beautiful, it's the story of my life, I don't want to do it. So there he languished, and he had seen it, Milos, and he said he had liked it, and so he came out there to the little hovel there on PCH, and he parked his car with his big cigar. He came in, so what would you do? What would you do with this script? Because they had sent me the script the night before, and I'd fallen asleep reading these earlier draft of Cuckoo's Nest. There'd been 9 years trying to get a script, and I fell asleep. I don't know, out of anxiety. I was just tired, and I didn't know. And I'd read the book years before, and I'd loved the book, and he came, and we had these little, those beanbag chairs. It was pathetic. And the one thing that the landlady had said, it was from the Valley, she said, don't turn the fireplace up too hot. It's going to crack the big picture window. This is the thing from 1953, this disgusting place. And of course, the first night that my wife was gone, I fell asleep in front of the fireplace, from sadness. And of course, the window cracked wide open. And Milos came the next day, and there he was. And I put tape on the window across this whole window, one of those ugly picture windows. He's looking at the window. He says, so what would you do with this script? And I thought, oh, this is hopeless. So I told him. First thing I remember saying is, I think McMurphy should come in and kiss the admitting officers. The kiss, he kisses one of these guys, and that of course stayed in the movie. And from then on, he would listen. Yes, and what else? And he hired me. He says, "Come to work tomorrow." And we worked at the Sunset Marquis Hotel next to the pool there. Milos worked in a maroon bathing suit with a 1965 World's Fair T-shirt. This was, mind you, 1970 something. He liked this T-shirt, and I had to sit with my back to the pool. Sunset Marquis was not a glorious place, and it was known as Ellis Island West, to admit people coming from New York trying to get into the movie business. And he would watch the girls walking by the pool. There would be pauses. It would be working by, and I thought, oh, something's going by. And you see two bikinis go by. I had my bag, I had a big orange bag, and I'd pull all my pages out, and I'd be working there. and that what it was, back and forth with the director. That's why I always try to get a director involved. Work with me. You sit with me. Anything you want. I'll bring you stuff every day. So that, because the only way I can work is out of collaboration. It's too lonely, as John Huston once said in the famous book of Lillian Ross's about the Red Badge of Courage. Picture, it's called. It's a really thing I really recommend. He goes to the window in the minute of talking to this New Yorker writer, and she said, well, why don't you keep on writing movies? Because he'd written The Maltese Falcon and so on. And he said, it's too lonely. And you want to do something about that loneliness. And I remember, so Milos, she said, okay, now what would you do? So I'd write lines, and then he would disappear. It was like a little L-shaped room, and then the short end of the L went to the toilet, into his bedroom. And he would disappear off stage, and he'd come on, he'd be McMurphy, and he'd say, what's the line? And I'd tell him the line, and he'd come out, and we'd do the scenes together. And that's how I began writing movies, And I knew it was going to be good the first day. I just knew it was going to be good. It was something I sensed, because it's not the collaboration, because it was McMurphy. I knew he had a movie in his head. My thing was to try to find a way to make it work, to make it do. And I worked that summer with him, and then the fall they brought me back on, and I was paid $8,000 to write Cuckoo's Nest. It did $200 million, which is a huge fortune in those days, overseas and everything. And then they wanted me to come back on again just before it was to shoot. So my agent, who is a compulsive gambler, said to him, he said, why don't we just sweeten it? They were going to give me another $3,000 or something like that. And they said, why don't we just sweeten this a little bit? And he said, if the movie does $20 million, Bo will get a bonus of $50,000. And Saul Zantz, who was the money guy and the producer, he said, listen, if it does $20 million, I'll love to give him $50,000. Well, it did $200 million, and so I got $58,000, but actually I was paid $8,000, Not that I'm obsessed with money, somewhat, like everybody is. I always think of the end of Act One, Mosshart's, apocryphal but funny autobiography. He said, if you ever think that I ever did it for anything but the mess of pottage at the end of the line, you're crazy. But it's not the mess of pottage. You should get the mess of pottage if you're good. The whole thing is to try to make it good and try to let them make you do good things. So then Cuckoo's Nest was my first movie produced, and won an Academy Award, won 4 Academy Awards, so the major Academy Awards. The big ad after the Academy Awards was that it hasn't happened since it happened one night, because it won for Best Picture, Best Producer, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Screenplay. So those are the 4 big awards, and it won, and it swept them. And so then I got every nut house picture in the book, and now and I don't like them. Don't like nut houses. And then I stumbled around, and I began to work on The Rose. And I remember this was before Cuckoo's Nest opened. After I'd done the script was sort of known around town already. My sort of calling card had been Shoot the Moon, which nobody would do. Then when Cuckoo's Nest, we had to wait for Jack to finish Chinatown. That was the problem. And in that period in which we were waiting for Jack, my script of Cuckoo's Nest had gotten around, and so now I was somewhat in demand. And they kind of pounce on whoever the new boy is in town if they think he can do something. And I went to work on The Rose, which had been kicking around for a long time. And I was on a week-to-week basis working with Marvin Worth and the famous Michael Cimino, who did Heaven's Gate, the famous Heaven's Gate. And we would work, and they were wonderful nights late at night over at Fox, and they'd put me on every week, and I would keep the check. I'd get this check every Monday. There was this wet bar in my room there at the Sunset Marquis, and my agent walked in one day, and he saw all these checks lined up, and each week they'd say, we want you to stay another week, Bo. They always thought it was going to be done that week. They saw it was getting better and better. And I was afraid to cash the checks because I thought, if the movie doesn't go on, you have to give the money back. And the agent said, are you crazy? and he took all the checks, I remember, and he put them into his bank account. The next day he gave me the money, but he said he was so afraid that I was going to lose the checks. But that's the way I felt about it. I was so happy to be working. It's sort of like between sex and pregnancy. It's like I didn't make the connection, with babies. And then after that, then Melvin and Howard came around, and Ned Tannen, I'd done an odd thing, which was also in this kind of caesura there, they got me to do King Kong, which was this phantom King Kong that Universal did because Dino De Laurentiis had swiped the rights, and Sid Sheinberg who was the head of Universal, with Lou Wasserman, and they were furious because they had wanted to do King Kong. So they created this phantom King Kong without my knowing about it, that it was a phantom. I didn't know about the other King Kong. I was not hip then. And in fact, they ended up winning a big lawsuit against Dino De Laurentiis because I was brought into this room, this big legal department one day, and they threw this novel at me. And this was the first novelization of a movie, and some very shrewd legal genius, an old guy, Lou, somebody who was the head of the legal department, said, let's buy that book that was published in 1937. We'll own the rights to King Kong. They threw this book at me after I'd written 2 versions of the script. Didn't know that there was another one. And they said, you're adapting this book now because we own the rights to it, and Dino De Laurentiis doesn't. Well, of course, Dino De Laurentiis got there first, and they knew he was going to. And he got the movie on and didn't do very well. And then the Universal sued him for multiple millions of dollars, and I became their star witness, okay? And they won their lawsuit. And then my agent then called the head of Universal to see, as having been the star witness and all the work I did, would I get some reward? And I remember the man said to me, he said, if I were you, I'd be making this call, and I appreciate it, but there will be no reward. But I remember always thinking that was a win, that script. But it was sad, and UCLA has the script, and kids take it out, and I'm quite fond of it. It was sort of issued from my memories in Central Park with my mother, and that's where the movie began. So then from that, they got a hold of me to do Melvin and Howard. I was kind of floundering there. And Melvin was like the talk of the talk shows. He was sort of like a kind of benign version of the Elian Gonzalez case. Everybody, it was in the news day in and day out. And then Ned Tannen, who had grown fond of me through the King Kong episode, who was running Universal, said, listen, these 2 guys have bought the rights to this guy who supposedly was left money by Howard Hughes, and he found him in the desert. And he said, I wish you'd take a shot at it. I said, are you crazy? I said, the single most boring subject in the world is Howard Hughes. So he said, do me a favor, go out there to Utah on a Sunday with the producer, Art Linson, and just see what you think. Okay, so I went. We got in the car early in the Sunday morning, flew to Salt Lake, and the car drove us to Ogden, Utah. Right away I got interested because the limousine there, I remember, in Salt Lake was sort of green. I'd never seen a green limousine. And it had a Mormon driver. We stopped for coffee, but there was no coffee at the coffee shop because it was a Mormon coffee shop. And these sort of beautiful waitresses, and it was a very clean and scrubbed look. And I remember coming, and I said, all those girls sort of look alike. He said, yes, we call it, he said, they have the Mormon aura. And right away I began to be intrigued. We got to the gas station that Melvin ran. He had a little house up above the gas station. He didn't own the gas station. He managed it, and he wasn't there. He was tithing after services on a Sunday for the Mormon church. He arrived late with Dulcie, the character that appears in the movie, and we spent the day talking, I remember. And I remember I came back, and Ned said, what do you think? I said, I'll do it. He said, I'm so happy you're going to do it. He said, but tell me why you're going to do it. I said, because I am Melvin. And thus it began. And I went out by myself. And I'm not a big guy with a tape recorder or anything. I have a tendency. One of the problems is when I tape Melvin, through these 4 weeks, he liked to drive, so he drove the car, which was an old not an old, we rented Monte Carlo, but it was so hot in the car that I opened the window, so the tape was barely audible. I remember when they transcribed it, but when I got these transcriptions of our conversations, our life, I just knew I had something. And we ended up with Linda. And I remember there was a journalist, she's still sort of big kind of sort of women's movement journalist named Marie Brenner, who she made this farewell to Hollywood in one of the magazines that existed then, Los Angeles Magazine or something like that. And she said, a perfect expression of what's wrong with Hollywood is the guy who just won the Academy Award is for Cuckoo's Nest. Guess what he's doing next? The life story of Melvin Dummar, the schmuck who pretends that he got left money. It was just terrible. It was the most awful thing, you know. And then Time magazine picked it up, and I said to my agent, I said, why are these people killing this movie before I've even, put pen to paper? He said, oh, they're just having fun with it. But I could tell he didn't understand why I was doing it. Nobody understood I had doing it. Cuckoo's Nest was a big hit, and I was doing this schmucky little movie. And I went to work on it, and it languished for a while, and Mike Nichols was going to direct it, and then Jonathan Demme came in years later. He was hanging around an executive's office. He saw this script. It's these old stories, you find scripts laying around, and he begged to do it. And they said, if you can do it for a price, we'll let you do it. And he did it, and that won another Academy Award. I almost fell over. My agent said, you're going to win again. I said, no, don't be ridiculous, And he said, I can tell because you're the short odds in the pools already. Plot has always been my weakness, of course, and that's what the Writers Guild accentuates, plot, who has done the groundbreaking and so on and all that. But really the plot is the lie of a movie. It's the lie. Life isn't lived in an hour and 50 minutes like that. The plot has to cheat you, has to be compressed. All these events have to come and they have to roll in a certain kind of, how do you say it, in a kind of inexorable way. And, and you have to accept that lie, and I think that's the thing that I've had the most trouble with. I would say to any fledgling screenwriter, ignore that, though, ignore that. In a way, Melvin and Howard was a flop, it just didn't make a lot of money. It's become a cult movie over the years, and the videos keep selling and so on and so forth. But it was really just about two men, a younger man and an older man, and just you kind of put them together, and where do they go? I always felt it would have been an enormous hit if the will had been admitted to probate. And I can remember sitting with Melvin Dummar. I lived with him for a month. We made the trip together from Gabbs, Nevada, which is where they mine lithium for depression, interestingly enough. And then, it's the most disgusting place in the world. Of course, there's the scene of him throwing the bags of whatever that phosphate is that goes into it. And then we made the trip. He showed me where he picked up, Howard. And I kind of put together the thing about the motorcycle, because guys in the casinos in Vegas said they knew he went out, he had a motorcycle. So that was my guess that what had happened. But I remember when I finally then met Linda, because he was divorced from her, as those who've seen the movie might remember, and she was living down next to Disneyland, of course, in Anaheim, or actually it wasn't Anaheim, it was Hawaiian Gardens, I remember. And so he kind of turned me over to her, I think they came it was Labor Day night, and he was leaving the next morning to go back to Ogden, Utah, where he lived. And she came that night to dinner. So we ate dinner together, he with his divorced wife. So I spent my time with Linda, and it was like, I always think of this thing. I once saw a documentary with Raoul Walsh, the famous kind of patched-eyed director, did a lot of great kind of tough guy moves at Warner Brothers. And I see her, and he talked about discovering Humphrey Bogart. And I remember him saying this thing, Georgie Raft. We got Georgie Raft, the guy with the coin, and he said he was all set to do it, but then he dropped out. He didn't want to be killed, and so we had then. I mean, there's a guy around a lot, young guy. We heard he was, I kind of liked him, named Bogart. So I said, okay. I went to Jack Warner and I said, okay, let's put this Bogart guy in this movie, High Sierra. And Warner said, okay. And he said, and he came in, he reported for work, and he said, from then on, it was like a summer's day. And that was it. That's how they made movies then. But I remember that when I met Linda, it was like a summer's day. It was so easy. I mean, the way she talked, like this kind of a nice moment for Mary Steenburgen in the movie. She talks about her dream, about, she wanted to be a French translator. And here's a woman who was a cocktail waitress at a bowling alley in Hawaiian Gardens, California. And her dream had been to be like Jacqueline Kennedy and to be a translator, at the great tables of diplomacy. When he brings the boat back that he's bought with the winnings from the game show, and he parks it in the driveway there in Melvin and Howard, she says, what did you buy the boat for? The money, they've had money for the first time in life. And he gets angry at her, and she says, well, c'est la vie, Melvin, or something like that. He says, what's that? He says, it's French. I wanted to be a translator for, French translator like Jacqueline Kennedy, and he says, I can't, I'm just paraphrasing, I said, well, you're not. And she says, I dreamed of being a translator like Jacqueline Kennedy. He said, well, you're not. She said, I told you it was a dream. And that was the whole secret to it. I mean, the kind of gallantry of these people. And just to go back to the things I was saying earlier, I mean, I was Melvin. I felt like these people. I mean, I'd been raised on Park Avenue and all that, but I always felt impoverished in some way. I had no money. I was given no money. No money was settled on me. When I got out of college, I worked. My first paycheck was $33.33 a week. I remember, but it was about plot. It was just to try to follow these people's lives. Oh, I know the thought was this. Here's the thought I was thinking of. The night that Melvin left, as I say, I always thought the movie would have been a big success if the will had been admitted to probate, whereby I believe he was to get something like 1/32nd Melvin, because he had picked him up in the desert, which would have been some $70-something million, okay? And and there were some scary moments. A real tough movie lawyer here who was said to have been one of Hughes's pimps, named Greg Boutzer, who'd married a lot of famous actresses like Dana Winter and so on. I remember having drinks with him. Somehow he'd asked to see me. So he said, listen, you're barking up the wrong track. This is a lot of crap. This guy never found any will. It's nonsense, and forget about this thing. And why don't you just go to Universal and tell them you're not going to do this movie? I said, no, it interests me. How do we, and he got a little tough with me. So I said, I had just won the Academy Award for Cuckoo's Nest, and those kind of days I said things like, well, you know who I am? He said, we know everything about you, Mr. Goldman. That's when I got scared. And he was the lawyer for the Hughes Medical Institute, which at that time was the sole beneficiary of, the major beneficiary of the will. And they eventually actually got the money through some distant cousins of his, the Lummises, he was a guy from Houston, and they were from the side of the family that Howard absolutely loathed. But the point was, and of course they're the ones that got the money. He'd gone to Harvard Business School. And that became the Summa Corporation, which of course is famous now, that controls some of the great casinos in Las Vegas, which I think have now since been sold. But anyway, we were in the car that night. I was saying good night to Melvin because I was now going to turn my attention to Linda. And he said to me, which is odd for me because he never said anything to her. He was just a kind of rough and tumble guy. I mean, years later, to flash forward, he ended up selling frozen fish from Alaska out of the back of a truck at high schools. They would drive to high schools, and they would try to get the kids to buy this frozen fish to take home, okay? So he said, well, what do you think about this thing? I said, what do you mean? He said, about the will. I said, well, I believe you, Melvin. I believe this happened. I believe you're going to get the money. He said, no, I'm not. I said, what do you mean? He said, how am I going to get the money? I'm Melvin Dummar. I said, what are you talking about? He said, how's Melvin Dummar going to have a shot against the Lummises and the Hughes Medical Institute in Miami and all those lawyers? He said, they're going to eat me up alive. And he was right, you know. And here was I, the Hollywood screenwriter who should have known better, you know. And that's sort of America, you know, like they weren't interested because, you know, although the movies lasted and movie people liked the movie, and I seem to be remembered more for that movie than almost anything. But I can remember I had agents, an agent at the time who was a very, you know, savvy customer, and he was, you know, didn't want to say it to my face, but he was so pleased that the will had not been admitted to probate because the very innocence that he abhorred in me, he felt had been put to the test because I believed him. And they say a con man can only con a guy who's willing to be conned, or a cheater can only cheat a guy who wants to cheat. He said, he could have only put it over on someone like you, Bo. Only you would have believed him. Well, I still believe him, and a lot of people do. And the proof of the pudding is, with Melvin, is he was never indicted. They never accused the will of being false. They just didn't admit it to probate. And then after that, you know, offers kept flooding in, and I became this sort of fat cat, and kind of, I bought this land up in Napa. I was never around. I was always traveling to writing movies in London and someplace else, and we were never home there. Still in this little house in Malibu, and I had a business manager at the time who suggested, he said, you ought to buy a house. You're just throwing all this rent down the tubes. And my wife said, we're never here. Why do we have to live here? And when I was writing Melvin and Howard, one day at breakfast, one of the children said, somebody's coming up the ice plant. And this was on the side of this little house that you couldn't approach the house. And what they were subpoena servers, process servers from Los Angeles cousins of Howard Hughes, who were trying to subpoena my material. And so I ran out the back door, ran down to a payphone, called Tom Mount, who was Ned Tan's assistant. I said, I got these process servers coming at me at the house. He said, run away. So I got in the car. He said, go write the movie any place you want. Where? He said, anywhere. You want to go to Paris? Go to Paris. So I called my wife from outside the house, and I said, tell me when these guys have gone, because they couldn't serve the thing because I wasn't there. And she said, let's go to Lake Tahoe. Even you go first, because the children were still in school. So they may like to ski. So I said, oh, God, I'll be alone there in October in Lake Tahoe, which was what I was. And I wrote the movie there, and the kids came at the end, and they skied. And somehow the movie got finished. And my typist had moved from Malibu. I don't have a computer and don't know how to use one, and I don't know if they existed yet then. I bought the day I arrived here, I bought a $99 Hermes typewriter. I used to use an old office one back east, which I'd stolen from CBS, and in my worst days. And I bought this $99 Hermes at the Malibu Typewriter Company, and the guy made the bill of sale, and then he showed me at the door and he said, that's it, this is the last day for the Malibu Typewriter Company. You're my last sale. It closed up. I still have that typewriter, and that's what I write all my movies on, is this $99 typewriter. And so when I need to present the script, I then hire a typist to to type it for me. I wish I could get them to write it for me too. But my typist had moved from Malibu. Her boyfriend was a fireman, and California is rife with nepotism in the fire departments. Everybody's related. And he had wanted to get out of Malibu, and he had a cousin up in Northern California. And they'd moved up to Northern California. I located her from Lake Tahoe. I drove over, and I stayed in a motel while she typed, and my son came up, who was living in LA, to and he didn't know what to do, and we wanted to go riding one Sunday, and we found this piece of land in the Napa Valley, and we bought it and built a house. It's the first house I ever owned, is the one I bought the land for. And then I think I kind of went into a kind of sort of plateau. I'd never had any money. I couldn't pay my bills. Suddenly I had more money than I needed, and I didn't know what to do with it. And then a tragic thing happened. My son was killed, my first son, in a freak accident. A woman ran a stop sign in Santa Monica. He was kind of a brilliant. He was 22 years old. He was the youngest stockbroker admitted to the Pacific Stock Exchange on his 21st birthday, and doing very well. He was really gifted. I think one day he would have produced my movies. And she ran a stop sign, and he was going to meet his fiancée for their first dinner party. And he hadn't been on his little motorcycle for 6 months, and she took his truck to the brokerage office that day. She was his trader, and she ran the stop sign and she killed him. And it didn't work very well after that for a long time. And I don't think I really came out of it till the end of the decade with Son of a Woman. And in a way that was because of Marty Brest, who was somehow resembled my brother who I'd grown up with and brought me back into the world. And I had that kind of intense fraternal collaboration which I craved. And Son of a Woman was really about an older brother who I hadn't seen for 13 years, and I got this SOS from another brother who I hadn't seen for 13 years, who had somehow gotten involved. And this oldest brother whose life had imitated my father's, had made millions in real estate in New York, lost it all, and had become a hopeless alcoholic, was living in a fancy hotel in the Carlton House in New York, $5,000 a month, and had no money, and was incontinent, and was being robbed by floor maids and male nurses. And this other brother notified me, so I immediately got on a plane and went to New York. And I found him in the drunk tank at Lenox Hill Hospital. We brought him back to his hotel, and I tried to stabilize the situation as best I could. I had no kind of real relationship with him. And now my money had run out. I mean, I'd been through the decade, and things had dwindled down. I had my place. And then at the end of the decade, here was this opportunity to make this movie, and that had been kicking around, inspired by this old Italian movie, Profumo di Donna. The problem with foreign movies is they're really half a movie often, unless they're great ones, because they don't have the same standards of entertainment or holding an audience. And that's really I thought, what am I going to do? I hadn't seen the movie, and he told me about it. It didn't sound like much. So he said, well, come over, give it a shot. So I went over, and they screened the movie, and then within 2 minutes of it, I saw Gassman and playing this Italian army officer it was my brother, who I hadn't seen in 13 years. He was like my brother on the hoof. He wore my brother when I'd seen him when he came back from the hospital. He'd been brought back by the U.S. Embassy because he couldn't pay his bills at Baden-Baden, where he'd been, where he just had bespoke suits made for himself, just like the colonel was. And he had this beautiful jacket, and he would sit and would tie in his shirt after coming out of the drunk tank, Lenox Hill, and I'd sit with him. We'd sit in silence, and he'd ask me, it would be 10:30 in the morning, he said, how about a drink? Bobby, as I'm not beau to that family. And I'd say, no, thank you, Chester, and he'd start drinking. Well, from that, I met Marty. I saw this movie. I said, this is my brother. This is my brother. How can I not make this movie? So really, it was seeing my brother through this character of the colonel that made me want to do this movie. And that began if there's anything cautionary about it or instructive in some way, it's, that personal thing is what comes home. What comes home to you. People want to talk to me about craft all the time. I don't know what craft is. I don't understand craft. I mean, you either have had this, when finally, when your back is to the wall, and you got to go make a buck. I run out of money, and I go write a movie. That's the only thing to do. I know I have this place, and everybody thinks I have, that I'm sitting up there like a padrone up in the Napa Valley. No, we have a little house up there, and I'm glad to be distant from Hollywood. But at the same time, I have the same needs that anybody does to, keep working, keep my children going, keep my grandchildren going, pay the tuitions and all of that. And the relationship with Marty Brest was quite wonderful because he then had been kicking around at the same time. He'd had 2 balls in the air, whether to do Scent of a Woman or to do Death Takes a Holiday, which he'd had for years before. So after Scent of a Woman was successful, he said, will you come and, and Pacino had won an award and all of that. And he said, will you come and do this other picture for me because I don't have the right script. So I said, I don't want to see the scripts. Don't show me the scripts. I said, I'll work with you because I believe in you. So I came and reported for work, and they gave me a little office then. There were 7 scripts on the table. I read them all over a week, and then I met with Marty Brest, and he said, well, what do you think? Because he was sort of proud of the structures they had and stuff like that. I said, I don't know. I don't think it works. And he said, what's the matter? I said, there's no bottom. And he told me about this the other day. I'd forgotten. He said, I didn't know what you meant. I remember asking him, he said, what do you mean there's no bottom? And he said, well, a year later, I knew what a bottom was. And it's sort of like In Meet Joe Black became an eminently unsuccessful movie and sort of became like the schoolyard behind, like that kid, when recess is over and the bell rings, you go over and give him a kick anyway, just for the hell of it. And that's what that movie became. But in the end, I think it may someday have a life. There was something about the pace of it that people didn't like. Characters have to have a bottom. And what I really meant by that is that so much of dialogue often is chit-chat. So much of characters is something that's based on something else, I think, ad nauseum, I will say, is just this operative word that it has to live. And it's like the old thing of the the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart has said about pornography. They asked him what it is. He said, I know it when I see it, and that's sort of like, with a movie, how does a movie live? Well, you know it when you see it. I try and stay away from words like story and plot and dialogue, and they become a little bit like homework then, I think, the work, like feeling. What's the feel? How does it feel? And you kind of get the feel of things. I'm very disciplined. I don't say that proudly. It's a kind of sickness, I think, sometimes. What's discipline and what's a control freak. But I'm a morning person. That began in the Army, I think. And I think that's some genetic thing. I think my father, I would often see, staring at the ceiling at 5 o'clock in the morning. As a child, I would wake up and I'd go past his room, and now I realize he probably was thinking about this other family he had, which I didn't know about. And to this day, if I see change on a sideboard, I have to pick it up because I always used to remember that change that he would have beside his bed. And then when he went into the bathroom to shave, I would steal it from him. And I loved his pocket watch. And eventually my wife bought me a pocket watch. But I get up quite early, and what happens in the work process is this kind of escalation of intensity, which is it starts with a lot of research, and I don't like that word either. I just try to find everything I can about something. Maybe to brag a little bit is I've heard this line from directors from time to time, from various, where do you get these lines? Like a plucking lines, like they'll come in the next day with a change. It's something I might hear because you're trying to start hearing or Mike Cimino once referred to it as voicing the characters. That seems a little fancy, but you start getting a feel of how they sound and who they are, and I begin, like, where do they live? What is everything we can know about this particular place and this time? If it's an adaptation, where is the book or the source material centered? I went to work that's been uncredited on The Perfect Storm, which is coming out this summer, and I knew all about Gloucester, Mass, because my father's art expert in the 20s had gone to Gloucester every summer to paint. He was a painter, and I'd gone to school in New Hampshire, and I knew those fishermen, and I knew what they were like. And at the same time, I remember saying to one of the research kids there, I said, get me some New England argot, and what I mean, the way they talk, This kid comes with this printout, like New England talk, calf or car, have it square. I said, this is no good. This is what the internet gives you. So I said, go hire a guy with a tape recorder and put him in the bar there in Gloucester, in the Crow's Nest. And then I want a transcription of that tape. And well, in 2 days I had that, Out of that tape, out of that 20 or 30 pages of garbage, there was maybe one usable line. I'll take that line itself. But in it I began to discern something, and I said, these old guys come, and they start talking. They talk about nothing, swatting flies in the air. And so then I invented a character for the thing. The old timer had been a former sea captain. And I put him in, so one thing kind of leads to another. Then I die for a collaborator, the director. Let's talk every day, talk every single day. Then I go off by myself for a little bit. Then finally you're talked out and you're researched out until you can't stand it anymore. Your head wants to blow up. It's kind of like, do I ask the girl to marry me or don't I? The moment has come. And you go off and do it in an office somewhere or somewhere else or at home, wherever, you're going to work. But it has to be quiet. I work every morning. And then in the afternoons, that becomes, what should I do with the afternoons? I mean, I know when I first started, I was obsessive about, did he write with a pen? Did he write with a pencil? What did they do? Hemingway, a friend of mine, this director, Marty Bress, is now trying to write a movie on his own. He asks me all these questions. I said, like every little scrap I ever learned from the Paris Review and all that, it's all kind of comes together. But I remember Hemingway saying, never go back to it. I remember when I used to work on my musical in the theater, I'd go back around 4:30 in the afternoon and start doing it again, for a couple of hours and rewrite. Now I've gotten to I once wrote the same page 63 times, I remember. I was perhaps becoming ill then because I couldn't quite get it perfect. Now I have a tendency not to want to go back at all, to try to get it done as fast as I can. Because the faster I do it, sometimes the better it is. I remember once talking to an actor I worked, also uncredited, on Dick Tracy. And we had in there a guy to do a sort of bridge in the plot who was at the time doing the Federal Express ads, I believe, in which he talked a mile a minute. And so this guy was in the show. And I said, God, how do you talk that fast? He said, because it's more comprehensible. He said, what? I said, what are you talking about? He said, no, they found that the faster people talk, the better people understand. So it's sort of like the faster I write, the better off I am in some way. I mean, the more you study it and you're in then I go back and go back and go back. And somebody said, well, you should see the first draft we got from Bo. I mean, right now I'm doing a movie I'm going to direct if we can get the money for it, and they keep saying, this first draft we got from Bo. Well, it's not the first draft, it's the 10th draft or 12th draft. I don't count them. Who wants to count them? That's ridiculous, but it's not right. Another thing I learned from Oscar Hammerstein when I wanted to be a librettist in the theater, he said the one rule was, and I had written him, somebody said, who did you want to be when you were a kid? I wanted to be Oscar Hammerstein. I didn't make it. Stephen Sondheim got there before me, but I remember he wrote me a letter, Oscar Hammerstein, and he said, because I wanted to work for him, and he said, your enthusiasm is wonderful. He said, to advice I don't know what to tell you. So if anything can stop you, it will. And if that doesn't happen, nothing will stop you. And I think that's the whole idea. If you want to do it, there's nothing that's going to stop you, but you're not. And the other thing that Hammerstein said, not in his letter to me, but I read later, he said, never show it to anybody. And I don't show it to anybody. And I used to early on, not about movies, when I talked to people about it. You know, some people you give their movie away over a drink, or they want to talk about it. Never talk about it. That's your little secret. You know, is what you do every day. And then in the afternoons, one day I went to the races. You know, and I thought, oh God, this is wonderful. I mean, Hemingway always said never go back to it. He used to fish in the afternoon. So I wanted to write a movie about the races, and I got to know some of the guys. And after I got my father's colors back, then I became friendly with a trainer, and he made a deal with me. I wouldn't have to pay the board on the horses, and I got together with some guys from the Oakland Raiders who were like the administration and the team doctor. We bought some cheap horses up north, and we had some fun with them. And I'll go to the races sometimes in the afternoon. And then I didn't feel so lonely when Dick Francis, who writes the great, you know, English horse racing books, which are sort of, there's less horse racing than more and more. He goes every day to the races. He said the important thing is not to bet. They don't bet much. He doesn't bet at all. He said, because if you bet, you're only watching one horse, which is a wonderful lie. But just anything to amuse myself. Sometimes I just go do errands with my wife, anything that I sort of feel useful. I mean, everybody, I've studied everybody for work habits. I remember Flannery O'Connor saying I work from 9 to 12 and then I collapse, you know, because I'm so tired. Or Willa Cather used to get down on her knees and say a prayer before she started. I remember once I was so desperate I did the same thing, you know. So I think it's real important not to work all day. I think you work part of the day. My method of getting started is to find everything I can about my character. So it depends upon what I'm doing, you know, what I'm doing about the sword boat fisherman. Send the guy into the bar, get the dialogue, remember what happened. Glean this if you're, you know, take a piece from the book from here and take a piece from the book from there. Some guy, the guard at the gate says something to you, you use the line. I remember the Ferrari scene in Son of a Woman. I was living alone over there in Toluca Lake. My wife was trying to keep my children together up north, and there was a crooked garage there. The guy was since closed down because he had a car of mine, and I mean they were putting fake motors in or something like that. This guy had this Ferrari. I was there this first night, and I'd rented this little house, you know, over there in Toluca Lake, and I was alone at night, and I saw this Ferrari take off out of this. He owned a Ferrari, the guy with this crooked garage. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the Colonel drove a Ferrari? You know, I mean, and it sounds like, this is like, I remember Fred Coe, my mentor, saying, above all, don't be writerish. So I'm being writerish right now. You know, I remember there's a big writer, I won't say his name, who coincidentally bought a place down the road from me up in Napa. And he put a table up around a bend in the road, and he has the table there, and he has his laptop computer there. And I passed him on the road. He's sort of looking into the middle distance, I guess for a line or something like that. It's sort of like in Oxford, Mississippi, after Faulkner won the Nobel Prize in that little town in Mississippi, nobody knew, you know, what he did. Then he won the Nobel Prize, and he was known all over the world. And then he came back, you know, to go to work on his work. He turned around one day, and there was the door open, you know, in his little office there in this university town in Mississippi, and 3 heads were in the door. And he looked over, and then one of them said, there he be, writing. And so you must never think of yourself as that. I mean, and I think of everything like that. I mean, like Dickens saying, they said, how did he find the stuff? He said, well, he always thought of the parrot on his shoulder. And they said to Dickens, well, what parrot on what shoulder? And he said, well, no, the parrot on the shoulder who tells me what to write. So, well, you write it. No, I don't write it. The parrot writes it. And whenever I'm stuck, I turn to the parrot, and the parrot tells me what to say. And although that seems facetious, I really feel that whatever is moving me to write, to try to get in touch with that, and I don't want to get into some double dome thing about it, but it's like something that comes up from underneath. And if you don't, the sweat will always show and the labor will always show, that somehow if it flows, if you let yourself go, it's like a love affair. It's like a moment with your children. It's like anything that comes naturally. So if you say to yourself, thank God I'm alive, that's what the writing process must be. But before I make it sound too glorious, I hate getting there. I loathe it. To me, it's absolute toil and turmoil to have to think of writing a movie. And I think, oh God, I've got to write. I wake up, and I talked about the intensity escalating. As I get closer to the end, I start waking up earlier and earlier. So probably towards, the last 20, 30 pages of a movie, I'm up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I finish, maybe at noontime, and I'll be working 9 hours straight then. But normally I'll wake up about between 5 and 6 in the morning and quickly have a cup of coffee and go to work. James Michener, the great novelist, used to keep his typewriter right next to his bed. And I mean, he was a married man and with a big family, but he just rolled, so he could roll out of his bed right into that chair because he felt that the best material came then. Evelyn Waugh's son, Oberon, I remember once reading about him. He worked twice a day, like he'd work in the morning and in the afternoon, and in between he would go to his club and play squash. And when he got up in the morning, he put on a coat, a tie, a vest, and shoes, shine the shoes, go to work like he was going to a bank, because his father, Evelyn, had always said, think of it as a trade, because Evelyn Waugh's father had been a book publisher. So, each to his own. But, as Andy Roney used to say, that he didn't care for Shakespeare because he didn't care for the 36-inch stride that the actors all used. I mean, I don't care for the ponytail and the look into the middle distance and the sense of you're being somebody different. It's a privilege. It's a privilege, and it's an honor, and it's a mysterious thing that you have this gift, and the thing is not to ever let go of it. What I would say to a young person who wants to be a writer, I think I've said some of that already. I would, quote Hammerstein again about, if anything can stop you, it will, and if it doesn't, then don't worry. I remember when I was at a loss, and I couldn't get my musical on. We were into the 6th or 7th year. I'd get $5,000 a year in option money. Fred would renew it. And I'd sold shares in it to my rich friends, so that eventually, even if the musical had ever gone on, I would have never gotten money because I'd sold it out. And I had to do some research one day, and I went down to Princeton. And I had a professor there. He's quite a famous professor. He was Robert Frost, the poet's biographer, Lawrence Thompson. And he'd always been fond of me, but he didn't know anything about the theater or anything like that. And I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and it was a rainy day in central New Jersey and damp, ugly, and I'd gone to the library there because that was the only library I could really find my way around, and I mean, if I needed something like that. I remember somebody once telling me they'd seen Peter Ustinov on television about, did he do research? Yes, did he go to libraries? And he said no. They asked him why. He said because he didn't like the atmosphere. And I don't like the atmosphere in libraries, but I had gone down there, and afterwards I had run into Larry Thompson, the great biographer of Frost, and he just asked me, he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm trying to write this musical for Broadway, and I can't get it on, and this and that, and so on. And he didn't say anything, he just sort of looked at me. He was a kind of flinty New Englander. And then he said to me, how is your courage? I remember that. I almost burst into tears, How is my courage, And I thought he understands. And what I would say to a young writer is, I think what you need more than anything is courage without ever being self-conscious about it. It takes a lot of courage. Everything will get in your way. Your parents will get in your way, or your children will get in your way. With a lot of guys, their wives get in their way, or with the wives or the women, their boyfriend or their husband get in the way. I remember there was a guy who used to write Sunday morning religious shows, Morton Wishengrad, his name was. He wrote a beautiful little play that Art Carney was in called something, I lost the title, but it was about a child who kept wearing a glove because she only had 3 fingers on her hand. It was about sort of like what, sort of something hidden in a family. This guy used to write a Sunday morning religious show like Lamp Unto My Feet or something like that, something for the, I think it was a Jewish show. And his wife would sometimes stop him. He'd just come out and she said, "How's everything going this morning?" He'd say, "Fine." He'd have to hide the play from his wife because she knew that Lamp Unto My Feet was what paid the bills, And these are the problems that, you're caught with as a writer. You want to do good things, but sometimes if you also have to make a buck, and that's the problem. It's always, it's an old saw here in Hollywood. It's a struggle between art and commerce, or a marriage of art and commerce. I sort of loathe the expression because, that's all you have to do is marry art and commerce, and you'll be a big success. Well, it's not that. I was just talking to a man the other night who's a oncologist, a great research oncologist, and I talked about the jealousies and viciousness in Hollywood. I was particularly bitter about a credit situation. He said it was worse in academia. We're supposed to be the most intelligent people. So I said, well, one of the problems with this credits thing, or trying to do something good, is that they said, well, it's a shrug to people. You're getting paid. And he said, well, that's not fair. He said, why shouldn't you get paid well if you're good? Being paid well with your good isn't what it's about. What it's about is doing good work. And if you're doing good work about good things, you're going to get paid well. So everything I would say to a young writer, keep going, keep going. That's all you can do is keep going and until life stops you, and I hope it doesn't.